All right, so we'll start with item 5, presentations. Item A, geothermal and aquifer resources in the Eagle Foothills.
Thank you. My name is Steve Schaps. I'd like to thank you for letting me come and talk about this today. I know it's not a typical city council type of agenda item. So my talk today is on geothermal and aquifer resources in the Eagle Foothills. I'm a retired geophysicist, which is very similar to a geologist. My contact data is email thewildwestguy@gmail.com. I'm going to start with some disclaimers. I'm not giving anyone professional advice. I'm not an employee, contractor, consultant, developer, or professional. I'm not licensed or employed in any way. But I do provide free geologic and aquifer advice for anyone who wants it, even on specific individual wells or areas. I also lead geologic field trips for the Idaho Museum of Mining and Geology, and my next field trip will be to the shoe-fly oolites. And those are kid-friendly and family-friendly events. If you don't know what the shoe-fly oolites are, you can Google that on your smartphone, and you'll see pictures of a really cool geologic area. My next field trip will be on November 12th, 2023, and anyone interested can sign up on eventbrite.com. There's a small cost, and kids are free. So the data I used in my study is public domain data. I used the Idaho Department of Water Resources well data. And
Can I ask you a quick favor? Can you make it so that it's a presentation mode? It's down there at the bottom by the minus sign. There, up a little bit.
Okay, you might have to show me.
Oh, there you go, right there. Yep. There you go.
There we go.
Now we can see it better.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so the Idaho Department of Water Resources has a lot of water data available and drillers' reports for individual wells, and a lot of data in their adjudication files. It's kind of a hard word to say, but this primary one is 63-32-573. That would be West Avamore and Villanova area. There are several hundred documents in there. It's enough to make your head explode. The Idaho Department of Water Resources also has a geothermal database, and they also have an oil and gas well database. And there is an old oil well that was drilled in Eagle in 1927 near Dry Creek. It was a dry hole, but it went down quite deep to 1,562 feet where it hit basalt. So it went all the way through the aquifer. So it's a very good control point for mapping. I've also received some help from BSU Professor Spencer Wood and various geologic publications. I've made my own field observation, and I've included in this packet some backup slides for some of the other aquifers that I'm not going to talk about in detail tonight that people can look at if they want and get back to me if they have any questions about my work or about their own individual wells. We're going to have to start with some geologic definitions. I know this is a little bit painful, but on the surface, most areas have the Pleistocene, which is less than 2 million years old. That's the shallow aquifer, which is mainly sand, boulders, and surface deposits. That's important for some of the areas that I'll be talking about tonight, especially things like Lexington Hills and the lowlands around Eagle. A lot of the production of water is coming from the Pleistocene. There's a big erosional unconformity at the base of the Pleistocene, and then we go into the Pliocene, which is Lake Idaho deposits. So these are 2 to 4 million years old. These are most of the municipal water supply is coming from these deposits. There are sand silts, clay stones. They're important aquifers in the main Eagle area downthrown from the Eagle West Boise Fault. They include what's called the Pierce Gulch sand and the Chucker Butte basalt. They're upward coarsening and prograding deltaic sequences where rivers were feeding deltas into Lake Idaho, and those deltas were now drinking water from the sand layers. They also include some fine-grained clay stones in the lower half and blue clay layers. And this was a very active tectonic era. So they're Pliocene age faults, but they don't cut through the Pleistocene. So the Pleistocene has cut them off, and there's no current earthquake risk of any kind in the Eagle area. But the faults are very important for segmenting the groundwater flow and for the pattern of development that we're seeing in Eagle. Below the faults, there are usually some lag sands. They're of unknown age. They're deposited on top of the next unconformity down. They're usually on top of volcanics, but sometimes the volcanics have been eroded through, and they are on top of the Cretaceous granite, which is about 65 plus million years old. This is known as the Idaho batholith. And this is granite and fractured granite. It's sometimes highly altered along fault zones, and the fracture density increases near the Pliocene age faults. That's very important for homes that are going up into the canyon where they're relying on the fracture density to produce water, because granite without fractures is not permeable. It's basically tombstone. So you have to have the Pliocene age fractures to produce groundwater from the granite. There are also sources of both arsenic and iron in groundwater. Think that arsenic is coming from rhyolite volcanic ash. The iron is coming out of the basalt, but there's other sources of iron. Iron can also come out of the granite because of things like iron pyrites in the granite that are dissolving. And sometimes that iron is found in sedimentary rocks up much shallower and kind of unpredictable patterns. The granites are important reservoirs in the upper foothills, but fracture density and reservoir storage may be limited away from the fault zones. I'm first going to start with the geothermal part of my talk, which is only a couple of slides. I think most people in this room are unaware of the fact that there's a geothermal field in the Eagle foothills. And it's a different type of geothermal field than what we see in the main Boise front. So this is like the state capital area, a very well-developed, low-temperature geothermal field. It's about 175 degrees coming out of the wells. It's used for heating of buildings and structures and hospitals and houses, and it includes both injection wells and production wells. So they're able to keep the pressure of the reservoir up by injecting water into it. There's a second geothermal field, Turtling Springs, in the Edwards greenhouse, that's less well developed, and it may be in connection with the Boise front geothermal field somewhere, because they're seeing pressure support over here from injectors over here. So these two are both low temperature geothermal. And then way over here, we have a geothermal field in the Brookside area, which is outside the city limits, but still inside of the Eagle foothills. So we're going to take a look at that Brookside area. So there's several wells, at least 5 wells in the geothermal field right now. There's one well down here or off of North Brookside Lane that produces water at 140 degrees in fractured claystone. That well had almost artesian pressure. So instead of the water level being 100 or 200 feet down below the surface, it came up to within 16 feet of the surface. So it has unusually high pressure. There's also 3 homes over here in Sombra Canyon that have water at 85 or 86 degrees from fractured granite. I'm pretty sure that water is being diluted by groundwater at 58 degrees, so it's being cooled off. And then over here in Woods Gulch, there's another well that tested water at 98 degrees Fahrenheit from Miocene volcanics. I need to try to verify the exact location of that well, but it's probably being diluted by 58 degree Fahrenheit groundwater. And I think there is a prospect for high temperature geothermal resources along this fault trace here, which is an anethetic fault. So you can see the definition here. The synthetic is the main fault, and the antithetic is a fault that comes into it from the opposite angle and creates these little down-dropped grobens here. So I've included the geothermal well numbers if anyone wants to look them up. There are various low-temperature geothermal uses. Right now it's being used for heating homes. One of the homes over here in Somber Canyon is for sale now. I noticed that the real estate ad features prominently the fact that it's geothermally heated. It's also being used for heat down here at the McConnelly well on North Brookside Lane. What else could you do with this? You could maybe build a hot springs resort. I think I'm in favor of that. Maybe agriculture or some other use. But the big prize here is if we can find electrical power generation water, something that's hot enough to create electrical power, because that is the greenest of all green power sources for electricity. It doesn't pollute. The technology's changing where they're able to create electrical power at lower and lower temperatures, using what they call a closed loop binary circuit. So in the future, maybe it doesn't have to be 212. Maybe it could be, less 190 or so. So let's look at the subsurface model for this geothermal field. This is a different idea than the Boise Front geothermal fields. Those are convection models. There's water circulating down in the earth through porous media. It's coming up along sandstone beds and being harvested for its heat. This is more of a conductive model where things are not necessarily circulating like that. They're more trapped. And there's also no hot springs on the surface here. The other Boise Front geothermal fields all had historical hot springs on the surface. As far as I know, there's no record of any historical hot springs in the Eagle Foothills in this area. And there's the probable fault. Here's the well at 140 degrees. This well up here in Woods Gulch was at 98 degrees. And this well down here in the Brookside fault block was intentionally deepened by 150 feet for the purpose of harvesting the geothermal water. So they must have known somehow that from the temperature down here right near the bottom of the well that it was increasing quickly, so they could just drill another 150 feet and it went up to 140 degrees. What is it over here at the fault? That's hard to say, but I think it's going to be significantly hotter in both the horizontal direction and the vertical direction, because I think there is a high temperature geothermal prospect in fractured granite underneath this area, underneath this fault, and that this water is semi-confined. It's not able to get out of the aquifer very easily. We know this North Brookside well was almost artesian in nature, and we also know that wet claystone is a very good thermal insulator, so it doesn't transmit heat very easily, and the temperature over here at the fault is going to be a lot more than at the well, and the temperature 500 or 800 feet deeper below the fault is going to be higher still. It's maybe debatable what that temperature is going to be, but it's suggestive of a high temperature geothermal prospect in this area, in the fractured granite below the fault. This slide kind of segues into my aquifer topic. So in this area of North Brookside, there's a shallow Pleistocene age sand. So this is the erosional unconformity. This would be like Dry Creek right here in the middle. These aquifers are not in communication with the deeper claystone, and we know this because when you drill a shallow well, you find water at typically about 30 feet or so, but when you drill a well that's outside of the Pleistocene, you find water at 100 or 200 feet, or maybe you don't find water at all and you drill a dry hole. So this Pleistocene, Pliocene claystone is very important for the development of the Eagle Foothills, and it's mostly deep water shales and vuggy clays with thin discontinuous sand and blue clay layers. So not a very good aquifer. So I've sorted out the aquifers in the Eagle Foothills and the Eagle area and listed them here by the number of existing homes in each aquifer. You know, the main Eagle aquifer is on the low side of the Eagle West Boise Gulch, West Boise Fault, and that includes about 95% of the population is drinking water out of this aquifer right now. And there are 2 different municipal supply companies, as well as several hundred individual wells, that being the City of Eagle's own water company and also Veolia, which used to be Suez, and they're both producing water out of this aquifer. And my opinion is there are no major problems in this aquifer except in isolated areas and isolated wells due to inadequate penetration into the aquifer of some of these domestic use wells. And what's inadequate penetration? Less than 10 feet is inadequate, because you've got to leave room for the pumps, and there's seasonal water variations, and there's climate change and land use changes. And those wells get a lot of attention when they go dry, but they're not characteristic of the aquifer in total. There's also some limited areas of high iron content, kind of spotty areas. And by high iron, I mean greater than 300 parts per million. Iron's not a human carcinogen, but it is an irritating thing because it stains porcelain, and nobody wants that in their house. The next most populated fault block right now is the Dry Creek Ranch, and that is from a Pliocene sand aquifer. There's no major problems that I'm aware of with that aquifer, except there is a fault to the west which cuts off the fault block, but that fault is down dip from the producing wells and about a mile away. So it might impede flow someday from that direction, but it seems to have plenty of recharge from up dip and from the sides, so I'm not particularly worried about that fault block. The fault block I'm most worried about is the Brookside fault block and the Pliocene claystone aquifer, not the shallow Pleistocene aquifer. So there are 2 different aquifers there, because that aquifer has poor quality reservoir rocks, which are limiting the housing density and increasing the dry hole risk and drilling cost. They're much deeper, and there's a lot of scattered dry holes on properties in that fault block. And below that is the Shadow Valley aquifers. This is the area up near the golf course. Most of the development right now is occurring on the west side of the valley, and those rocks are fractured granite, and it seems to be going fine right now, but if they move west outside of the valley area, they're going to possibly hit fewer fractures in the granite, because the fault is not there to allow the fracturing, which is going to limit reservoir volume and add risk to any housing developments out there. And then finally is the most contentious one right now, which is West Avamore and Villanova aquifers. There's 2 separate aquifers. So this is the area that is being built out for 14,000 homes or something like that. And I don't see any major problems with this area right now. But the water chemistry is slightly different between the 2 aquifers, and that chemistry is going to change over time as the radius of influence reaches out to areas of the aquifer that haven't been tested yet. And that will eventually become the City of Eagle infrastructure. So any problems that develop in the future are going to be our problems. And if there's enough public interest, I can come back and talk about that aquifer in specific I don't really have time to get to it today. So I wanted to talk about the Brookside fault block today. So this is the geothermal area, and you can see the faults. So this geothermal area overlaps the Brookside fault block claystone area. And there is a big fault here, the Eagle West Boise Fault, several hundred feet of throw on it in here, and it separates the main Eagle Aquifer, which is prolific, from the Brookside fault block. And then over here on the other side, the Dry Creek Ranch Aquifer is separated by another fault from the Brookside fault block. So in this shaded area, we have poor quality Pliocene claystone reservoirs, which have limited storage capacity and limited production capacity. They also have a much deeper water table because they're not in communication with the shallower Pleistocene. The shallower aquifers, generally less than 80 feet deep, may have insufficient volume for higher density development and may have water quality risk for denser development. They're using septic systems, there's runoff, and right now it's at 5 acre spacing per house, maybe more if you look at the entire area, and denser development would be more like 5 houses per acre. So it'd be a lot more houses than what the area is currently able to sustain. And there are areas in here that the Pleistocene is too thin or too shallow to have water in it. And in those areas, they've drilled much deeper Pliocene wells, which have a very substantial dry hole risk. There are properties in here where somebody's come in and bought property and drilled a well and it's been dry. So what would we need to put in denser housing in here? We would need water sourced from either the main Eagle Aquifer on this side or the Dry Creek Aquifer on that side, both of which seem geologically sufficient for 2,000 plus more houses. So if I did the math right, 2,000 houses at 200 gallons per day per house, plus a little bit of lagniappe, equals about 400 gallons per minute in a flow rate for a well. By comparison, the Boise Hunter Homes wells up here, there are 2 of them right next to each other, and those both flowed at more than 3,000 gallons per minute. So that's tremendously higher flow rate than what would be needed to put denser housing into this Brookside area. And we'll look down into the earth here. This is a subsurface diagram. So we're looking down. This diagram starts at the east end of Eagle Island. So these are the gravel pit lakes and some of the ponds and lakes around the low areas of Eagle. Here's a canal. Here's another canal. Here's the Farmers Union Canal, which cuts right up near Floating Feather. That's probably the most important canal in Eagle for aquifer recharge. It's a big canal, about 80 cubic feet per second in the summer. It's cut into the Pleistocene, which is very sandy, and we know from monitor wells that it's recharging the groundwater, and the water table is coming up during irrigation season by 2 or 3 or 4 feet next to the wells, and then it's falling as soon as irrigation season stops. And that is also the canal that a couple years ago Boise proposed dumping treated sewage effluent in. And they have backed off from that proposal, which is a great thing because that effluent would have gotten into our aquifer almost instantaneously, about 2 weeks. And then we come across and we come over the Dry Creek Valley and across Beacon Light over to Highway 55, and then it turns slightly and comes over here to Dry Creek Ranch. And you'll notice that the Pleistocene unconformity here cuts across the faults. So the faults are not visible on the surface because they've been truncated and they're buried underneath the veneer of Pleistocene sands. And there are some places where the Pleistocene in this Brookside fault block isn't thick enough, or it's high enough where it doesn't have water in it. And then they're having to drill down much deeper into these claystone reservoirs, which have fractured vugs in them, but the vugs are very difficult to predict and very difficult to map. So you could drill a well right here and contact 2 or 3 different vugs and have a good well, and then right over here you could drill a dry hole right next to it. So it's a very difficult aquifer for people to get into. And if you drive up around Brookside Lane, you'll notice that almost all the homes are lined up along the Pleistocene channel of Dry Creek, and they're getting recharge from the Pleistocene, which is flowing right across these fault blocks uninterrupted. So if you looked at the Pleistocene here, you'd find the water level about 30 feet or so. Right over here, it's also 30 feet. Over here, it's 30 feet, but you've only got 15 feet of sand, so it's dry. And then over here on the other side of the Dry Creek Valley, it's at 30 feet again. So the Pleistocene reservoir is uninterrupted by the faults. The faults are very significant here in the aquifer segmentation. On the downthrown side of the Eagle West Boise faults, most of the wells are producing from 200 to 400 feet for the municipal supply wells. The shallow wells, the domestic use wells, are much shallower, generally being less than 100 feet. And there's plenty of sand and plenty of recharge and plenty of potential to drill additional wells into this aquifer. And then you go literally across the street, and there are some dry holes and some very deep wells in the Pliocene. If you drive up towards Beacon Light, you're actually crossing this fault before you get to Beacon Light, and you instantly see the housing density change. And there are all these big empty fields where the Pliocene is near the surface and they can't make a Pleistocene well. And then you go over and cross another fault here, and the Dry Creek Ranch wells are up here. The Boise Hunter Homes wells went through a Pliocene age lag sand that was very thick and porous. They both went into the volcanics, but they found something they didn't like in the volcanics, and they wisely plugged back into the Pliocene sand and made some great completions there. Those wells are probably some of the best in the whole Treasure Valley. So they have a sweet spot there. And I'm also showing some fractures in the granite coming up and feeding water into the shallower reservoirs. They're actually feeding water up maybe even into the Pleistocene, because we find some high iron content and occasional scattered wells in the Pleistocene. And they're very important for the development in the Shadow Valley area. That's my last slide. I'm going to just click through some of the backup material so people can see what I've included in here. Steps on curing the geothermal prospect. Some infrastructure maps showing the trace of the West Boise Fault on a bigger scale. So showing the Willow Creek Aquifer up here and the Eagle Boise Aquifer on the other side of the ceiling layer, and showing the infrastructure of the Suez or Veolia pipeline coming up here and providing water to Hidden Springs and the existing homes at Avamar, not the homes that are going to be built in the future. Those will be provided from water from this side, but the existing homes. And there are other sources of water coming up into this area from Veolia that are providing water to Avamar and Hidden Springs. So some of the water is coming from Eagle, but not all of it, maybe not even most of it. And their main well in Eagle is this floating feather well located right next to Eagle Middle School. And they have another well down here at Redwood Creek, which they are connecting or already connected to that pipeline. But we don't see any aquifer drawdown or problems in this area here of the Eagle West Boise Aquifer. This is some diagrams I made up for the Willow Creek Aquifer that's being produced and commingled with the other aquifer in the new development area. There's another one, another diagram. They have different water tables by over 100 feet. So geologically, these are two separate aquifers. I've also included some of my own geologic elements with examples in the Big Gulch area, which is the area of the new developments. Several pages of that if anyone wants to read about the aquifers in more detail. I wrote some other publications that people might be interested, ranging from, pickleball to history, to geology, to groundwater resources, kind of a COVID winter project there. And then this is the database of the wells that I used in my study. I can also send this to anyone who wants it in Excel format. If you're good with Excel, you can plot them up on a map, and you can see my individual comments, geologic comments about individual wells, which are mostly the deeper wells in the area, because they're redundant with the shallower wells. And this is the old oil well here, which didn't produce, but it is important because it provides a pinning point for the depth of the basement rocks and went all the way through the aquifer. So there's a lot of those. So you can see all my little geologic comments. And this PL means that's where I'm picking the base of the Pleistocene unconformity. And that's the end of my talk.
All right. Any questions?
I got one, Mr.
Okay, yep. Councilman Pike?
Steve, that's a very thorough presentation that you just gave. Can you give us some indication of what type of fault lines are there? Are they thrust, strike, slip, tectonic, hanging wall? What kind of?
They are normal faults associated with either basin and range or, so these faults here, so they're extensional faults. So this probable fault synthetic is this one, and this antithetic fault is this one. These have basin and range trends. They're older, and then they're cut by the Eagle West Boise fault, which has more of a Snake River Graben trend. So this is the younger fault. They're both Pliocene in age, but this is the younger one. So these are not thrust faults. They're not strike slip faults. They've been seismically inactive for a long time.
Transform faults then maybe?
No, they're not transform faults. Transform faults have a strike slip motion to them. These are just simple pull apart faults.
Okay.
Where there's extension in the Earth's crust and it's pulling it apart. These are basement involved faults as well.
Good answer. Thank you.
Now, I'm told I can't take questions from.
Yeah, we're gonna hold off on that and have the presentation, and then if people want to get a hold of you, you kind of gave them some.
Okay, I'm going to
so.
go out in the lobby now and answer any questions, but thank you very much. You can also download this report from the Eagle website. And if anyone has any questions they want to ask me confidentially, they can email me to thewildwestguy@gmail.com, and I'll respond and maybe answer their questions or help them out with their own individual well or their own individual area.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
All right, I might have you come out and check out my well.
I'll be happy to do that.
Okay, sounds good. I appreciate it. Thank you.